Thank you very much, Zeid, and to all of our friends and colleagues from the Diplomatic Service, the Diplomatic Corps here in New York, and those who are joining us from around the world. It's good to have you all at the IPI. And we here at the International Peace Institute have had our board meeting yesterday. We're pleased to report that Zeid is doing well. And at least that's what Zeid assures the board members. And being a believing set of souls that we are, we accept his word for it. But no, the IPI is doing a terrific job here in New York in support of the UN system. And we intend to be robust partners, both of member states and at the Secretariat for the future. Thank you, Zeid, for the opportunity to talk for a little while just about this book. It's entitled The Avoidable War, and I wrote it in the last year or so out of a sense of duty, because I became increasingly concerned that a view was emerging on the part of many, both in the United States and the People's Republic of China, that crisis, conflict, and war between Beijing and Washington was becoming increasingly unavoidable and in certain quarters described as inevitable. Those of us with a mind for international relations history find that an enormously troubling prospect. For the simple reason is I don't think those who casually talk about it have any idea about the catastrophic consequences which would ensue from a conflict, however limited, between the world's largest military power and the world's second largest military power, and the world's largest economy and the world's second largest economy. So the reason for writing this was to wrestle with the problem in a way which I hope is constructive and useful for the international community and for governments both in the United States and the People's Republic of China. The book seeks to do two or three things, pretty simply. The first is to describe as dispassionately as one can how did we arrive at the current juncture between China and the United States. It was only 5 or 10 years ago that the combined description of this relationship both in Beijing and Washington was one of continued strategic engagement. Yes, there were difficulties, there always have been since diplomatic recognition back in 1979 in the first contact with Nixon, Kissinger, Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong in 1972. But by and large, the pattern and the fabric of engagement economically, politically and foreign policy collaboration around the world overshadowed the structural differences and difficulties and system dissonances between China and the United States of America. That, however, has changed. And there are several reasons it has changed. One is that the balance of power between the two countries has changed radically. China is infinitely more powerful than it was against most measures of what China would describe as comprehensive national power than it was a decade ago. The Chinese have a term for this. It's called 综合国力, comprehensive national power. For those of you old enough to remember a country called the Soviet Union, and for those of you who remember the Soviet method of calculating power, which was through a concept called the correlation of forces, the Chinese concept is not dissimilar to that. And the way in which the Chinese calculate power is not purely against a military framework, but equally against an economic framework, a technological framework, a national resources framework, a population framework, etc. And China's own internal analysis of where it has evolved in the last decade is that its comprehensive national power is much greater than before. Secondly, China uses code language such as the world is now inevitably more multipolar. That's code language for less American power and more Chinese power. I'm sorry to disappoint our friends at the UN in terms of what it actually means when our Chinese friends use it. And that furthermore, in the public discourse of Xi Jinping and others most recently, including an article this morning by the head of the Taiwan Affairs Office of the Party Central Committee, Liu Jieyi, formerly the permanent representative here in New York, again talking about the significant changes in comprehensive national power and that these historical forces are now inevitable and irreversible. This is China's internal discourse about its increased material power and how China perceives its power and calculates its power in relation to the United States. Second reason why we are where we are is that since the election of Donald Trump and the national security strategy of November 2017, there's been a fundamental shift in America's response to China's rise. You see that articulated in the security and strategy statement of that year, where H.R. McMaster, then the National Security Advisor, said strategic engagement has concluded and it failed, and furthermore went on to say we are now into a period of strategic competition, and that is the only way in which the United States can prevail against a rising China. So in other words, since that time, and by and large prosecuted on a bipartisan basis with the Democrats since the election of the current Biden administration, this framework for the US response to China's rise has now been in a process of change within a framework of strategic competition since the end of 2017, now for the last 5 years. If there's a third element to the admixture, which gives rise to where we are at the moment, it's the particular leadership style of Xi Jinping. Most of us in national political life have had some opportunity to spend some time with Xi Jinping. I've had that opportunity as well. But I've also made something of a study of Xi Jinping's worldview. And Xi Jinping, if you look carefully at his writings internally, it's quite clear to me that Xi Jinping is not a creature of the status quo, that Xi Jinping is an agent of change both within his own country and in terms of China's role in the region and the world at large. In terms of the changes domestically, what I track in the book is the fact that because of Xi Jinping's ideological understanding of Marxism-Leninism, that he in fact has been moving the dial of Chinese politics further to the left, more role for the party, less role for the individual. Secondly, he's moved the centre of gravity of Chinese economic policy further to the left, greater role for state-owned enterprises, less role for the private sector, as reflected in the recent travails of firms such as Alibaba, JD, Tencent and the rest. And thirdly, what he's done is also move the dial of Chinese nationalism further to the right, and China has become a more assertive foreign security policy player in the region and the world. And these attributes, if you like, in my own analysis, as reflected in the book, are very much part of the Xi Jinping leadership style, quite apart from the underpinning changes in the geopolitical balance of power and the United States' response to it. So if we ask ourselves the first set of questions is, why have we got to where we've got to? The argument outlined in the book is that it is attributed to those three sets of large-scale changes. The second part of the book seeks to identify what exactly do we mean by Xi Jinping's worldview, and what do we mean by his plan for China domestically and China in the world at large. In the book, I seek to define that as 10 concentric circles of interest, starting with, as it were, the most important from the perspective of the Chinese Standing Committee of the Politburo, out to less important, but still nonetheless highly significant areas of interest. It's my attempt to suggest what Maslow's hierarchy of needs might look like from the perspective of the General Secretaryship of the Chinese Communist Party. So therefore, what you see in the book outlined in this question is not authorized from the Chinese system. You will not see it in any Chinese government text. It's simply the thoughts of Kevin and how I best interpret, not interpolate, the system. And in quick one-line summary form, it's a bit like this. Core interest of Xi Jinping is to remain in power and to sustain the Communist Party in power for the long term, not the short term. It's a Leninist proposition. Number two is to maintain the unity of the motherland. And that means not just China's perspective on Xinjiang and Tibet, but it's also China's perspective on Hong Kong and prospectively Taiwan. Number 3, grow the economy for 2 reasons. To grow China's comprehensive national power, you can't become a global security power or even a regional one unless your economy can sustain it. But also grow the economy so that the living standards of the Chinese people improve and that the post-Deng Xiaoping social contract with the Chinese people of ever-increasing living standards and ever-improving employment opportunities creates a relationship between the Communist Party and the people, which offsets the absence of an ability for the Chinese people to participate in a democratic electoral process within that country. In other words, it's part and parcel of continuing legitimacy within the Chinese system. Number 4 in this list is to do so now in a manner which is environmentally sustainable. This is new, but then again, for many countries around the world, it's relatively new. But China, because of a rolling series of crises in terms of air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and the rest, and Chinese people not wanting to die early because of bad air or bad food, this has then thrown itself into the front line of political and policy priorities of the Chinese leadership. You may recall the day when the skies in Beijing literally turned black in the middle of the day, and Xi Jinping left the Zhongnanhai compound to come out and give a press conference in the streets saying, "We will act on this." Because he sensed quite intelligently and rightly that as far as urban China was concerned, unless the cities were cleaned up, that in fact that would undermine the social contract. So as a consequence of that, it translates not just into a domestic program of environmental sustainability, but into a broader commitment to climate change action as well, given the axiomatic connection between carbon emissions on the one hand, in terms of air pollution and particulate matter, and climate change as well. Item number 5 is build a powerful military, to paraphrase Xi Jinping's language, to fight and win wars. Not to have parades, but to fight and win wars. That's his language, not mine. And the modernisation of the PLA to be a world-class fighting force is now scheduled to be complete as a process within the Chinese system by 2027. This is big and important for China. Item number 6 is, in terms of its foreign security policy, to incrementally push the United States out of East Asia and the West Pacific. But this is necessary from China's perspective and the prosecution of its long-term strategy on Taiwan. And furthermore, it's necessary in terms of China being able to secure its own sense of national and regional freedom for manoeuvre by not being, as it sees itself, hemmed in by a series of constraining US security alliances with the Republic of Korea, with Japan, with the Philippines, with Thailand, and with Australia, the 5 treaty partners of the United States in East Asia and the West Pacific. Number 7 in this Maslowian hierarchy of needs is not the maritime periphery to the east, but the continental periphery to the west. And that is to ensure that China, if you look across the Eurasian landmass and into Eastern Europe and then Western Europe and then into the wider Middle East, represents a zone of economic opportunity and foreign policy cooperation as far as China's national interests are concerned. It's been the principal, therefore, object of China's Belt and Road Initiative. If you look at the enormous investments which China has made in infrastructure, other investments which China has made in terms of a telecommunication system and digital commerce networks, the vast territorial terrain which represents Eurasia has been a principal but not exclusive focus of China's BRI campaign. It's also been the focus of a range of softer security policy measures by China as well, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, CICA, CICA, the cooperation on security, including a range of countries across Eurasia, and other such entities as well, including the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The whole strategic rationale is that this is a vast landmass which does not face anything like the adversarial strategic realities that China faces on its maritime periphery to the east, which is, of course, the United States and its treaty allies. And central to its diplomacy towards the Eurasian landmass is to have a benign, cooperative, friendly, mutually beneficial relationship with the Russian Federation. You don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to understand the history of the Russia-China relationship, the Soviet-China relationship, and earlier the Imperial Russia relationship with the Chinese Empire. It's not always been a happy story. Back to Peter the Great, in fact, it was a decidedly unhappy story. And so therefore, from Beijing's perspective, a benign border with Russia, a mutually beneficial set of arrangements, both strategic and foreign policy and principally economic, is of deep interest and enduring interest to the Chinese state, and has been so since Gorbachev and Deng finally resolved the Sino-Soviet border back in 1989. And what we see now is the long-term strategic outworkings of that. Number 8 in this list of priorities is China's interest with its 14 immediate neighbouring states to have as benign, cooperative, and ultimately collaborative, and ultimately foreign policy compliant relationships with its 14 land neighbours. China has more land neighbours than any other country in the world, apart from Russia, which also has 14. And in China's tradition of foreign policy, the preoccupation with its neighbouring states is at least of 2,500 years duration, and has a very long historical pedigree. And so when the Chinese use the expression 周边国家外交, neighbouring state diplomacy, it is a core doctrine within Chinese foreign policy thinking. The second last in this seemingly interminable list is China's approach to Africa, Latin America, and the rest of Asia and the developing world, where again, through the medium of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's new commitment to the global security concept, its new commitment to the Global Development Initiative, but also its long-standing diplomacy and aid engagement with the continent of Africa, has been to secure maximally beneficial relations right across the developing world. China has always, going back to the 60s, placed an attachment and priority on its relationship with the G77. For a while, it was in direct competition strategically with the Soviet Union. And then subsequent to that, China built on those pre-existing foundations and have turbocharged them through the BRI and other investment initiatives. And last but not least in this list of 10, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is the future of the global order itself, the international system, which brings us to where we are today here in New York, New York. China's aspirations for an international system, including the UN, including the IMF, including the World Bank, including the WTO, which in the future is more compatible with Chinese national interests and values. Hence why those of you who are diplomatic practitioners will see the range of activities in which China now seeks to interpolate its own national language into UN resolutions, and also to begin to remove, where possible, we say classical expressions of the universality of human rights from other international instruments which have been negotiated in recent decades. China also has a further prong to its multilateral system aspirations, which is parallel to the UN and Bretton Woods institutions to simultaneously invest in other institutions beyond the UN framework, led by the BRI, led by the AIIA on infrastructure, and of course incorporated in various of China's +1 arrangements, whether it's 16+1 in Europe, whether it's 10+1 in the ASEANs, whether it's Africa +1, or those others that you see around the world. And this for China is very much a work in progress, but as I see it and analyse it, it is one which is now gathering pace in terms of the resources, intellectual energy, and policy resolve that you see across a range of fronts, quite apart from the increasing numbers of appointments of Chinese personnel to international institutions, leading international institutions, and the rest. In summary then, when people ask the question, what is Xi Jinping's worldview? My best answer, outlined in that book, with a little chapter on each of those 10, is that this represents my best distillation about how the Chinese Communist Party, articulated through the Chinese state, is articulating its interests and values in the world today and at home as well. The last part of the book, and I'll conclude on this, deals with, given all the above, given where we've got to in US-China relations, and given Xi Jinping's particular worldview, how then is it possible to navigate a way forward between China and the United States, which doesn't end up with an international order which leads inevitably to crisis, conflict, and war? The best way I characterise the current state of the US-China relationship is one of unmanaged strategic competition. Strategic competition is underway. The United States explicitly recognises that fact. China does not explicitly recognise that fact, but the operational behaviour of the Chinese state in relation to the United States reflects that reality in my judgment. But at present, there are no rules of the road. It is unmanaged strategic competition. There are no guardrails, no rules of the road. What I detect in the security policy domain, at least, is a rolling set of exercises over the last 4 to 5 years, which can best be characterised as push and shove, whether it's in the South China Sea over Taiwan, the East China Sea, and of course, those of you who follow the Sino-Indian border there as well. As equilibrium, to the extent that it is established, is achieved as a product of this process of push and shove until finally, hopefully, it resettles. The problem with push and shove as a means by which to establish equilibrium in international relations, sometimes one state or the other will push too far and someone will fall over, at which point you would then end up with an incident. And an incident, if those of us who have studied diplomatic history carefully, has a predisposition towards escalation once domestic nationalist politics intervenes in the equation to actually head north rather than south and become, in fact, a crisis. And when a crisis arises, then in turn its predisposition towards escalation rather than de-escalation, well, we've all read the texts and we know where it lands. The argument of the book, therefore, in conclusion, is rather than unmanaged strategic competition, there's an equally realist notion that I advance called managed strategic competition, or MSC. It's not an elaborate concept, it's pretty straightforward, really. Easy in the articulation, difficult in the execution, but in my judgment, nonetheless possible. There are 3 components to it. One is that when you look carefully at the strategic red lines between these 2 countries, they fall basically within 5 boxes. Taiwan, the horror scenario for us all. South China Sea, problematic given the number of territorial claims which overlap. And China's rejection of the Permanent Court of Arbitration's determination on its 9-dotted line claim. Thirdly, the particular complexity in the East China Sea between Japan and China over Senkaku Diaoyudao. 4, a range of possible scenarios arising from North Korea going further down the nuclear road and the rolling risk we all face of another underground test of North Korea's already existing nuclear capabilities. And 5, what I describe as the rolling daily undeclared set of red lines associated with cyber and space, which on a daily basis act as disruptive agents in maintaining the stability of the US-China relationship. As I said, in each of these domains so far, by and large, I can best characterise what goes on as push and shove. The alternative is through high-level diplomacy between the 2, that is through the US National Security Advisor and his nearest Chinese counterpart, presumably Yang Jiechi, the head of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Central Committee, but also reinforced by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, as well as on the Chinese side, the 2 vice chairs of the Central Military Commission. Around these 5 strategic red lines, through high-level work, high-level diplomacy, identify the irreducible red lines of each side, there is an argument which some say agreement can never be reached on that, and they're right. You won't get China and the United States to agree on a mutually acknowledged set of red lines on Taiwan. What you might do, however, is achieve at least mutual acknowledgement or understanding of what the other side's irreducible red lines are. And you might say, well, is that inherently stabilising? Would either side adhere to that? My argument would be that against the current norm of push and shove, on balance it is more stabilising to move in that direction that I've just described than the current opacity which characterises the system. Secondly, this is not based on strategic trust, it is based on rolling mutual verification. And thirdly, if red lines are violated, then the party doing the violating will have a full and complete expectation that a retaliatory action of one form or another, not necessarily military, would ensue. So it is an argument which says, is that on balance more stabilising than the current set of push and shove arrangements? My contention, having reflected on this for the last year or so, is on balance, yes. And that the effort must now go into 5 high-level working groups between the two parties to identify this terrain. It's interesting if you look back at the record. I was fortunate enough to have lunch with Kissinger yesterday here in town. And we were reflecting upon his meetings with Zhou Enlai and with Mao Zedong. Henry's now 99. His memory is crystal clear. And whatever Henry's taking, I'd like to take some as well. But the bottom line is this. If you look at the absolute strategic candour of the conversations between Mao and Zhou Enlai on the one hand, and between Kissinger and Nixon on the other, in the critical meetings of 72, ask ourselves with the full benefit of hindsight, was that stabilising or not? I would argue that on balance, applying hindsight, it was stabilising against the alternative. The alternative, which was, frankly, again, 25 years of push and shove, or 23 years of push and shove between 49 and 72, produced the Korean War, 3 attempts to take Taiwan by the Chinese, Eisenhower threatening the Chinese with nuclear annihilation twice, and then on top of that you had China's indirect engagement in the Vietnam War, and a range of other, shall we say, associated security challenges and crises. So against the historical measure, my argument is strategic candour, private, around carefully defined red line areas is on balance stabilising. There's a separate discussion to be had about what the landing point in each of those areas might be, but that actually is a matter for the principals, whatever views I may have privately of what they might be. If I was to give one illustration, however, on cyber and space, to have a mutually agreed protocol that the critical economic and national security infrastructure of each side is not subjected to any form of cyber attack would be a useful strategic red line. Any system which is blinded by such an attack, frankly, in the current strategic environment, is massively destabilising, as systems are blinded in the event of unknown crises which may be unfolding in their own material environments. The last 2 elements of managed strategic competition are relatively straightforward. If you can agree on the 5 sets of strategic red lines, or at least acknowledge through private diplomacy what they might be, then in terms of the rest of the US-China relationship, it can proceed on the basis of non-lethal strategic competition in the areas of foreign policy, in the area of economic policy, trade, investment, technology, and the rest, as well as the great ideological and ideational debate between China and the United States over the future construction of the international system. Is it to be China's notion of, let's call it, state capitalism, authoritarian capitalism, Marxist-Leninism, or however else it is described by our Chinese friends in the future? Or is it what the United States would describe as the continuation of the liberal international rules-based order? And as I say in the book, may the best system win in such an open, non-lethal competition across foreign policy, the rest of security policy, economic policy, as well as ideology. And the final element of this equation is this: being able to create sufficient political and diplomatic space still for the United States to collaborate in areas of critical global public goods. Climate change, global financial stability, nuclear proliferation, non-proliferation, the next pandemic, given how much we failed in the last pandemic, as well as some of the more material challenges which are the subject of debate on a rolling basis in the UN Security Council just across the road. That, in summary, is the book, and I welcome your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for presenting the book to us. And certainly, I think from the point of view of a listener, one would grasp how clearly the arguments are presented in the book. And it is a masterful book. I would urge all of you to read it, given its importance. Because we are a community closely associated with the UN, there's a reflection I'd like to share with you, and then if you could answer it in the two parts, and then I think we'll open it up to questions from the distinguished ambassadors and the senior diplomats who are here. In the book, you make it abundantly clear that the managed strategic competition that you advocate really can only be made possible through a direct, almost intimate, bilateral exchange of views at the highest levels. Two questions from that point. One is that you said there were no guardrails, and I think for many of us who work and live around the UN, the obvious sort of thought would be, well, there are guardrails, at least when it comes to the use of force. There's the UN Charter, there's international law, customary rules. You're almost saying that doesn't exist, or it's not applicable to China and the US, and they have to define their own rules bilaterally at a high level. And the second part is that you don't seem to give space to an intermediary to help them arrive at this point. Why don't you believe an intermediary would be necessary in this case?
Yeah, they're both excellent questions, Zeid. On the first one, I approach the task as someone who is a deeply committed liberal internationalist and multilateralist, but with the lens and the worldview of a political realist on the nature of US-China relations. Secondly, if you look at the nature of US-China relations, on the 5 strategic red line areas I've just indicated, the reality is these countries, the US and China, are primarily engaged in one form or another of securing their own bilateral arrangements with each other. Thirdly, that does not preclude the intersection of existing institutional arrangements which come from the UN multilateral system. Take, for example, the Korean Peninsula. There are a bunch of UN Security Council resolutions which the United States and China have collaborated on. But if push comes to shove on the Korean Peninsula, and this elevates to a point of crisis or conflict, the UN Security Council will be relevant, but it will not be decisive in what unfolds between these two countries. That particularly applies on the case of the question of Taiwan, which the Chinese would argue is nothing to do with the United Nations system and its internal matter, and which the United States would have a problem arguing it was material matter for the UN Charter, because even the United States doesn't recognize that Taiwan represents an entity under, a separate political entity under international law. If you go to the South China Sea and the conflicting maritime claims, China's rejected the Permanent Court of Arbitration's determination on the 9 dashed lines. And so this is very much a question of primary diplomacy between China and the Southeast Asians, including two treaty allies of the United States, or at least one treaty ally of the United States, the Philippines. And so if you go through the list, there is a thin fabric of emerging international governance in the areas of cyber and space, but it's very thin against operational needs and realities. And so for those sets of reasons, I'm seeking to address the core reality in those 5 domains which will determine the future of peace or war, that what we need to have is a stabilising set of bilateral arrangements between these two powers, because they will not welcome of themselves the idea of anybody being able to effectively mediate between them, and probably reject it. The final point, however, is that if we look in the rest of the relationship between China and the United States, in these non-lethal zones of security policy, foreign policy, economic policy and ideational competition, and the areas of cooperation I referred to before, the international instruments and the multilateral instruments are much more applicable and relevant to day-to-day operations. You've mentioned before in our private conversations the ICAO, the International Organization on Civil Aviation. Whatever disputes China and the United States may have on ICAO's arbitral decisions around the world, they are very much at the margins, not at the centre of the effectiveness of ICAO and what it does. Yeah. It comes to WTO, different, but let's look again recently, the WTO ministerial between the Chinese and the Americans. They actually collaborated on partially beginning to go down the direction of restoring the efficacy of the tribunal powers. Yeah. So what I'm saying in summary is, in the 5 lethal areas, lethal, destabilising and ultimately destructive areas for the regional and global order, the reality is they will not welcome arbitration, mediation, or in my judgment, the intrusion of international law, because they are 2 10,000-pound gorillas in the living room. Yeah. In these other non-lethal domains and in the cooperation domains that I referred to, then of course the multilateral system becomes fully into play.
Okay. I'm going to abuse my authority as the moderator and ask another question, and then we'll go straight to you, Burhan. But actually, it's to deal with your region. Your book is presented as an open letter to 2 peoples with whom you have deep affinity. You've lived in these 2 countries. You have many friends in these 2 countries. You have high-level contacts in both governments. And in setting out President...
And I speak their 2 languages.
And you speak their 2 languages.
Chinese, Australian, but not American.
And you lay out President Xi's worldview, as you said, in the 10 concentric circles. In concentric circle 6, there's quite a lot of detail about China's relationship with Japan, China's relationship with the Republic of Korea. Do you find, and I raise this question because when reading about Japan under the premiership of Abe, they seem to be moving one way and then the other in their relationship with China. But do you think that they understand China better than the US does? Do you think that the Republic of Korea, by dint of a common sort of geographic space almost, so their cultural affinities, that they understand China in a way that the US doesn't understand it?
I think I can only confidently say that they understand China differently.
No.
They do not understand China exclusively differently. But in the case of the ROK, for example, given the long civilizational discourse between the 3 ancient Korean kingdoms and the Chinese Confucian Empire over more than 1,000 years, there is a fabric of civilizational engagement and understandings, but also frictions which come from history and informs the current worldview in Seoul. But if you look carefully at what President Yoon declares on this question today on behalf of the new Conservative government of the ROK recently elected, it is a worldview much similar to that of the United States in terms of threat rather than opportunity. That was not the case necessarily with former President Moon, who was recently in the leadership of that country. Japan, because it falls much more outside the, let's call it the classic Sinosphere, and partly because of its archipelagic status, and notwithstanding the impact of Confucianism and of Buddhism in particular, by and large has evolved as a separate cultural and political entity for most of its history, and therefore on the occasions when military clashes have occurred between the two, and they've been limited in number, but they've been violent and decisive. The rest of Southeast Asia, the experiences of a different nature. It's largely a mercantile experience. If you look at the history of the Malay states, the history of much of the region, and the commerce with China back to the Tang and the Song, interrupted in the Ming, Qing more problematic as well, and extensive Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. Again, it's a different perspective. And as for we Australian interlopers, well, that's a different kettle of fish altogether.
Well, you've opened up now a direct path to the ambassador of Singapore, Burhan, please, and then we will come to Martin. Yes.
Thank you very much, Zeid. Thank you very much, Kevin, two personal friends and friends of Singapore. Good to see you. Thank you very much for your book, Kevin. I think you put out a very compelling vision for what you describe as a managed strategic competition. That indeed is what is needed, I think, and I think many in Singapore would certainly agree with you. Now, for this to happen, there has to be some degree of domestic political consensus in both capitals. And obviously, the two capitals have different political systems. And hence my question, what is your assessment of the prevailing consensus in terms of a desire to have this managed strategic competition or a managed relationship with some degree of dialogue and strategic candor? And in assessing this state of consensus or lack of consensus or varying degrees of consensus, what do you think we, the rest of the international community, can do to forge this consensus between the two of them, domestically, politically, and of course in the United States, it also has to be a bipartisan consensus. Any thoughts and reflections on that would be very much welcome, Kevin. And I bought the book as well, and I hope to get your autograph later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now that I'm in the retail game, buy as many books as you can. I'm boosting sales now. Without betraying the detail of conversations that I have had in both capitals, let me put it in these terms, as it may be useful for the discussion. What I sense, particularly in the last 2 to 3 months, is a search both in Washington and Beijing towards a mechanism, a joint strategic framework, which will help stabilize the relationship, but not necessarily normalize the relationship. And let me try and define my terms. By stabilize, I mean actively reducing the risk of incident, crisis, escalation, conflict, and war by accident. By normalization, I mean a resumption of earlier patterns of, let's call it, strategic engagement, both political foreign policy and across the economy without significant impediment. So I use the terms stabilization and normalization differently and deliberately. But what I pick up in both capitals is the sense that as of about the end of the first quarter this year, things had become uncomfortably dangerous. And I'm not pointing to any particular incident, but there's an accumulation of incidents, to the point that the emerging consensus in both capitals, independently, not in consultation with each other, was to go in search of a stabilization mechanism. So that's my overall point. Second is, seeking to be as explicit as possible in answer to your question, is that when I look carefully at the public language used most recently by both the US National Security Advisor and by the Secretary of State, and when I begin to see language used along the lines of, we now need to have managed competition with China and we need to have guardrails around the relationship, I find that encouraging. When I see also some evolution in China's own language on this question, and I begin to see external evidence that both are seeking to find a stabilization mechanism. Whether the language that I put in this book is used explicitly or not is used is irrelevant. It can be a similar concept dressed up in different language, because as you know from our own experience as diplomats or as politicians, proprietary ownership is important, in which case people putting their own wrapping paper around stuff is often a good thing. I don't care. I'm pretty old-fashioned. I don't like war, and I'd rather do a lot to avoid it. So, because wars are very untidy businesses in terms of who gets killed, who gets injured, and utterly unintended consequences. What can the rest of us do about it? I think there is a responsibility we all carry as friends and interlocutors of both countries, and in our case, allies, the United States and Australia at least, to be frank with each government that this sort of stabilisation mechanism is necessary for all of us. We're not asking for the impossible here. We're not asking for return to the status quo ante. We're not asking for a magic wand to suddenly normalise everything. The chasms are too great across all these other domains. But I think it is a legitimate request for those of us who have good offices in Beijing and Washington to say, guys, it'd be very useful if you could agree on a mechanism to stabilise strategically this relationship, because it affects all of us if, in a most fundamental and potentially existential fashion, if it careers out of control. And my final point is, the reason I have some confidence in arguing that case is that in the 2020s, I don't believe it is in the interests or in the calculation of either side to go to war. I don't believe that is their intention or their plan. I cannot predict that comfortably about the 2030s, but on the 2020s, I believe our principal concern is accidental crisis, conflict, escalation, and war, not by design. So if that is all the case, if what I've just said is accurate, then I think we have an audience which may have more open ears to this than some of us may have assumed.
Thank you. Martin, the Ambassador of Denmark.
Thanks, Zeid, for bringing us together. Mr. Roth, thank you so much for bringing your experience, your intellect and insight into what, of course, is a crucially important bilateral relationship. But as you just, and as Burhan also highlighted, of course, it's a relationship that is, has an importance far beyond the bilateral aspects. Now, you touched a little bit upon what was going to be my question. This thing about what can the rest of us do to actually influence, incentivize sort of a move in the right direction. So I will expand it a little bit. What can we do at the UN to try and get this moving in the right direction. You alluded to the fact that, well, international law is probably not going to be the main argument here, but are there other things that could be done with the United Nations as its framework to get us moving in the direction of what you call strategic stabilization?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Ambassador. My argument is this proposition that I put about managed strategic competition can be advanced to the two principles bilaterally. It can be advanced through critical regional institutions such as the European Union, and obviously multilaterally, depending on the attitude of member states. Bilaterally, to go back to the point I was making before, it's surprising how effective it can be if heads of government, appropriately briefed, can raise this in completely private conversation with the two principals here, Xi Jinping and President Biden, and leaving to one side the national position on everything else, on the other critical issues of the day, including Russia, Ukraine, including what's unfolding in terms of the global economy, on climate change, third country crises, Syria, Libya, Yemen, the rest. So I suppose reflecting on my own experience, don't underestimate the influence and significance which can be attached to a head of government, such as your own Prime Minister, engaging the Chinese and the Americans at that level with an appropriately presented argument. I think the second thing is, if I reflect on the European Union, and I've just spent a couple of weeks in Europe in various capitals, talking about this actually. I've been launching my book. I'm in the retail business. For institutions such as the European Union, the Commission and Brussels, to, quite apart from the position it's taken on China and the position that NATO has taken on China, and I'm deeply familiar with both of those, and the current state of negotiations between the European Parliament and the Chinese on the future of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, I'm across all of those things. So there are substantive European disagreements with China, for example. That does not remove or make it impossible for Brussels privately to be expressing to both governments the value in, let's call it a strategic stabilization mechanism or framework. And then the final thing you raise is here, which is probably the most complex beast of all, because achieving any level of multilateral consensus on anything, even the opening hours of the IPI, would be tricky. But for sober minds, for example, who currently find themselves on the UN Security Council, and given the sober charge which the Council has, as under the Charter, in terms of maintenance of global peace and security, and to avoid the scourge of war, remember the opening phrases of the Charter, there is an opportunity, I believe, for particularly those charged with Security Council responsibilities, permanent members or non-permanent members, to reflect to our friends in Beijing and in Washington that the Charter is enlivened by threats to global peace and security. And we are concerned about the absence of a stabilization mechanism or framework. And therefore, if that can't be the subject of formal deliberations here, we would ask you to consider and develop this informally. We informally ask you to develop this bilaterally with each other, because it affects us all. So if there's a common denominator to the three things I've said, it is quiet encouragement rather than formal démarche. And the reason I don't encourage formal démarche is that démarches usually, in my experience, produce the equal and opposite reaction to that which you desire.
That's right. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. I'm the DPR of South Africa. I think my first question was already covered by the Ambassador of Singapore. I was going to ask whether you are confident that your suggestions would have bipartisan support in the United States in particular, because we see big swings in foreign policy between the two parties whenever they are in power. And in particular, you mentioned there are possible the US and China cooperating on the global public goods. And again, that's an area where they have got very divergent policies, whether it is on climate change or health, social issues. So, but I think you somehow covered in the answer to the Ambassador of Singapore. My second question is a very simple one. It's about the subtitle of the book. You referred to the United States and Xi Jinping's China. I was wondering whether there's any significance to that. Why didn't you say the US and China? Thanks.
Well spotted, Ambassador. So let me answer the questions in the order in which you've asked them. The United States is a complex beast. I think all of us who live in this great country would have a common conclusion. And I've now lived in this country for the better part of the last 5 or 6 years. And I'm increasingly perplexed in reaching a clear analysis as to where this country is actually going. China, by the way, is a complex beast, and I've lived there for many years as well. And I don't think we have a clear understanding about where China may go longer term either, domestically. But I'll leave that to one side. In the United States, what I do, however, sense is that on the China question, when I go to Capitol Hill and I speak to Republicans and Democrats, I'm president of the Asia Society up here on 725 and Park. That's where I have Zeid's job. I'm actually the president and chief executive. I'm the chairman of the board here, so there you go. So I have all care but no responsibility because I'm just the chair. That's Zeid's problem. He gets to clean up the wreckage after me. So, but it's when I spend time with ranking Democrats and ranking Republicans on the critical congressional committees on armed forces, foreign policy, intelligence, and the rest, there is a remarkable degree of common view about, let's call it the China challenge, or in their language, the China threat. But there's also, because these senators and congressmen and women are also realists, that they are also, in my judgment, not simply grasping for that which is domestically, politically useful language for them to enhance their domestic political constituencies by sounding as anti-Chinese as possible. There are many sober minds on both sides of the aisle looking for this sort of stabilization mechanism as well. Because I'm not an American politician, I can't predict whether that is the majority or the minority view. But what I do know is that the hardheads, Republican and Democrat, are looking for ways through this, which does not automatically end in incident, escalation, crisis, conflict, and war. So the second reason is when I launched this book in Washington a month or two ago, I invited Senator Mitch Romney to launch it. I didn't go to the usual Democrat from central casting. I asked a mainstream Republican. Obviously, he's not a Trump Republican, and we know the history there. But it's interesting when you begin talking to folks like that, deeply experienced in Republican foreign policy and security policy over time, that they too, while deeply skeptical about China, deeply opposed to so many aspects of what China is seeking to do, are also not reckless and are looking for stabilization mechanisms. And so far, nobody has thrown bricks at this book, either in Washington or Beijing, yet. Touch wood, touch wood, touch wood, touch wood. Who knows what's going to happen? So I simply say this could be an indicator that there is a partial opening of the door. And your second question about Xi Jinping's China, the reason I use that term is because China under Xi Jinping has changed. And that is why part of my remarks before about the 10 elements of his worldview, if I contrast that with Deng, Jiang, and Hu, all three of whom I met in various incarnations of my career, this is quite a significant change in worldview, domestic and international. Yeah. So I use it to indicate there is a change in China's posture. Whereas in the case of the United States, if you like, on the China question, there hasn't been a huge change between Republicans and Democrats, to be quite honest. Yeah.
Munir, Ambassador of Pakistan.
Thank you very much. I think, Mr. Rudd, your presentation certainly is an invitation to read your book very, very carefully.
Thank you.
And congratulations. It was very, very lucid account. I have two questions with regard to the situation that we are faced with now, and perhaps this may be outside the realm of your book. Firstly, as you see the US-China competition, the concern for many of us who are on the periphery of the region of competition is the danger of being pulled and pushed into one camp or the other. How do you see the policies of both with regard to the search for allies and partners in their competition? Is this a core part of the strategies being followed by both, or a peripheral part of this strategy of competition? Secondly, you mentioned that in the WTO they have started to cooperate in resuscitating the arbitration system, which is a good sign. How do you see the prospects that people are talking about the decoupling of the US and the Chinese-led economic systems? Is that a likely possibility, or is the economic relationship between the two so intense that a decoupling is not a realistic prospect?
Okay. So, alliances and decoupling. My judgment on the first question, and here I speak as analytically, not normatively, I'm not making a value judgment one way or the other, is that alliances, formal or informal, is now a core part of the fabric of what China and the United States are doing globally. The evidence of that in all regions is fairly clear, and regrettably it's becoming increasingly binary. And one of the reasons I have in mind in terms of a stabilization mechanism between them is that it may temper that process which is already unfolding, and cause it to be less sharp than it is at the moment. If you think you're on a collision course with the other side, you seek to aggregate your friends, allies, and partners to manage all future contingencies. And that is very much the characteristic of what's unfolding now. Regrettably, but that's the reality. On the second part about decoupling, the debate on decoupling in Washington often gets all the headlines. There's a parallel debate on decoupling in Beijing, which doesn't get the headlines. I'll make a comment or two about each. In Washington, the decoupling debate is primarily about technology, primarily about particular categories of technology, and it is also about questions of China's ability to make full use of the international financial system. Where you see the greatest clarity emerging so far is in the demarcation lines in Washington about critical areas of semiconductor technology which should not be provided to China by any American or allied supplier. I do not see a constituency, however, in Washington to decouple completely.
No.
And when we talk about decoupling, we should think about it in terms of trade, investment, capital markets, technology markets, people markets, if you like, talent markets. In 2 of those 5, I see evidence of that happening from the United States, partially on trade and principally on technology. And if you like, foreign direct investment is drying up as well, but not in the others. But my final point's on China. Xi Jinping, from about 2018-19, began proclaiming afresh China's national doctrine, economic doctrine of self-sufficiency. He proclaimed, related to that, a new doctrine of what's called the dual circulation economy, which is greater emphasis on domestic drivers of growth, much less reliance upon external drivers of growth, and a national technology strategy called the Made in China 2025 strategy, which seeks to make China totally self-reliant in all categories of technology, over and above the United States or anywhere else. There's a danger, therefore, that between the 2 of them, you have unfolding a mutually reinforcing sets of decouplings. But don't forget in this, there is also decoupling with Chinese characteristics and not just decoupling with American characteristics.
Please, pass.
Thank you very much. Jan Naskoczek, I'm the PR of Poland, and I'd like to follow up on this issue, on this thread concerning decoupling, but in another sense, and also internal policies and politics of China. Because to manage competition, to manage any relation, you need a certain level of openness and knowledge. And what we observe in China constantly, and it's not just about COVID and zero COVID policy, it's limitation of any contact with foreigners and with foreign public. I myself, I observed during my time in China when it comes to universities and think tanks, meaning that in a very short term, we, not just Americans, we will have very limited opportunities to speak to people who are open to arguments, to discussion, because the nationalism on the universities and in this scientific approach is going in a very bad direction, apparently. So what's your take on that? Do you think that it will be going in this direction forever, or there will be kind of a reflection among people in power that if they want to discuss and if they want to be active in forging the new international order, they need to be a little bit more open for that, because for the time being, it will be very hard for us to find partners that we can discuss it with on Chinese side. Thank you.
It's a very good question. When I was a young diplomat on posting in Beijing, I remember going to the Polish embassy in the time of the Cold War. And so it was quite interesting then watching the emerging Chinese debates about greater freedom of discourse and what was happening in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and the rest of Eastern Europe at the time. So life is a diverse beast, and it changes over time. Mind you, it used to have great film nights at the old Polish embassy. We used to watch all these Soviet realist movies, so they were great. For us, pretty entertaining, but they were fun. So things evolve in diplomatic history, in political history. Under Xi Jinping, if you want to see a seminal text on this, it's Xi Jinping's what's called document number 9 of 2013, which is an internal document which was leaked, which outlines Xi Jinping's view on the need to completely restrict the debate within China itself. It was followed by a series of regulations for the media, for the academy, arts and culture, and other domains as well, certainly religion as well as minority communities. And this was all part of an ideological conclusion by Xi Jinping that the country had become too indisciplined, the party had become too indisciplined ideologically, And Xi Jinping's conclusion, this is him out of his own mouth, that the dissolution of the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, began because ideology was no longer robust. So going back to the title of my book, Xi Jinping's China, Xi Jinping's China has pushed domestic politics significantly to the left. That's an empirical reality. Nobody really disputes that. Therefore, when it comes to the rest of us engaging China on questions such as the argument of this book, managed strategic competition, it's not a mass engagement. At best, you are dealing with a limited number of think tanks and governmental institutions and party institutions, small in number, but who are still authorized to engage. That's the reality that we face for the foreseeable future. Yeah.
We were supposed to end 20 minutes ago, so I lost complete control over the proceedings. But it's a testimony to how interesting the comments have been and the reflections have been from Kevin in presenting his book. We still have Kevin for a few more minutes to sign books, and please get yourself a copy. And will you please put your hands together in applause and in thanks to Kevin for it.